All right. Welcome, everyone. This is a discussion on building zero data apps and entrepreneurship, and how we can support makers building software and how users can get involved, and a bunch of other topics around this. Rosano is the instigator on this. Rosano, can you give us a wave? Hello,
Wave.
welcome. Um, Rosano, let's get started by telling us about yourself.
I'm Rosano. I'm a entrepreneur, writer, and musician, and I'm working on apps. I call them zero data apps, which means they don't keep your data, so you get to own your data. And I have a few of them now. I have about five. One of them is for note taking. One of them is for like programming and automation. I have another one that's for flashcards. I have another one that's for self tracking or personal tracking stats that are important to you. And I have another one that's for like consuming audiovisual media from different platforms. So you can mix YouTube, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, different things in the same interface. And yeah, I don't have a nice ribbon to tie around everything that I do yet, but that's sort of an idea so far. And we'll talk about the rest.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, Rosano found us at Vision and found that we were working on very similar concepts. Zero data apps is something that Rosanna came up with the label of basically this mode of, what if data being on centralized servers controlled by the developer who runs an app. What if the data remained with the user and the developer just kind of built the app and called into the user data as needed? So zero data apps, you're like, you want to talk about, do business models change? Do people care? Paying for
Yeah,
software?
I think I was stuck in a certain way of thinking about this actually a while back, and maybe I've sort of uh, just relaxed with what I'm doing, because I think for a while I was so caught up in architecture and thinking that, well, specifically because I'm doing these browser apps that are not using servers and stuff. So I always thought like, okay, everything's happening in the browser. The user brings their thing and their personal cloud data, and there's no connection to the app, and therefore that really changes the business model because you're not holding the data. Therefore, anyway, you can't just like I used to say that it was kind of contrived to create this freemium experience, but I recently realized like 10 years ago when I did my first iPhone app, we let people download it for free, and that we contrived a mechanism where it's like a document limit of 10 songs or 3 songs or whatever. And people were fine with that. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, if I'll try it. If I don't like it, I won't pay for it. If I like it, I'll pay for it. So um, I still think there are challenges, but maybe it really is just as simple as selling stuff. I don't know, like or having a clear proposition to people, like, okay, here's what it is, and if you like this, here are some options for you to support it. But um, the standard challenge is just like, well, normally everything gets tied together. So somebody's interacting with your product or service, and so they have an account with you, and that account has the data. So there's this link between their data is on your space, and so for them to even access their own stuff, like you sort of mediate that relationship, and you can charge for it or do whatever you want. So when it's zero data and you don't have that relationship with the client, there's these different challenges of like, first of all, when do you ask? How do you how do you propose something that seems valuable? How do you also, this is maybe the most challenging thing for me now, because I've had a few people sign up through my funding button, and it's very anonymous, and I don't know who they are, and I feel weird about reaching out to them because I'm sort of proposing this totally anonymous, like, you can pay and I don't know anything about you. And now it's great, now I don't know anything about you and I can't contact you. So it's like there's something broken about that, I think. So that's a challenge. um,
Uh, Ben has a question. Please feel free to
yeah, go
unmute
ahead,
yourself and ask your question.
jump in.
Yes, and is this business profitable?
The best question. What do you mean by profitable?
Does it earn you a lot of money?
A lot? What's a lot of money?
Like about $300,000.
300,000. Well, I'm not making 300,000, but there is a guy who's making like 500,000, which theoretically could be organized the same way. So when you say this, you mean like there's hundreds of ways to do this, right? So I'm doing it one way, and I'm sort of, I guess I'm a very small business example. I don't know, I'm like one individual that's doing this, but the person who I was referring to, he's been doing this for like 7 years, and he's become very well known. He's done this Photoshop clone called Photopea. So there was a story that came out about him sometime this year. But I wouldn't say that like this is the easiest way to make $300,000 a year. If that's what you want, if that's a specific goal.
I think that's a good question. So basically, Rosano, your goal is to support yourself being an independent creator of software.
Independent creative software.
Yes. Yeah. And I think so. I think that's a really good statement to make. And independent is a weird word to make in there. A maker of software that supports yourself, right? Like. And I think I was trying to say the same thing with independent, meaning that you're fully funded by the software that you make. Who else on the call aspires to be an independent maker of software?
I do. I've been seeing people like posting, hanging around on Product Hunt and stuff like that. People posting SaaS businesses where they're like, I know how to do this one thing, and I'll set up a service, a web API that you can just call into, and I'll do this thing, and you just pay me, $5 a month, and I'll do this thing for you on a REST API. And so that's kind of what I've been interested in doing, and then potentially like mixing that with like an open source model where like I've coded the whatever is doing that thing. And really you're just paying for the hosting and like the support through me. And that's what your $5 a month is getting you. But I'm not, collecting telemetry and all this other questionable stuff. But I think that's the future. And that's what I was hoping to hear more about here at this, on this call. So.
Specifically, which parts of that did you want to hear more about?
Well, I guess is that profitable? How profitable is that? Is there anyone on the call that has like a SaaS business like that and can talk about kind of the experience of setting that up? Yeah, just to get some experience with that.
I mean, I think that's the same question what the previous person asked. Is this when you start from the idea of profit? I mean, it's a legit question. Like profitability means that you're sustainable, right? So, I think the reason we're having this call is that we don't have like a clear answer for that, and there's some aspect of this that we need to figure out together because it's not clear like how you do that without holding the data of the person, right? The traditional SaaS model of like charging $5 for a month for a web service usually implies that you're holding on to their data in some way. It's not this sort of disconnected.
No. I totally disagree with that. So you're selling someone something, and we already had Mark say that I guess I'm selling them hosting, and I guess I'm selling them support. But I've already written the code, so it doesn't cost me anymore to do the code. Yeah. I have limited time to do support, and hosting costs some amount of money. But I think that's exactly something to question is what are you selling in infinite software?
Can I jump in? Maybe?
Please.
All right. Hi.
Hello.
I can maybe give some context and contribute to the finding out what the question is, I guess. I've been running. I've been working on software as a service businesses since since it was like becoming like a thing basically in the beginning. I did a lot of Ruby on Rails, which was like, the Basecamp people and kind of invented like pushing the entire industry to going like software as a service over things that you install on actual physical computers in a business and then charge a license fee for, running the program on X amount of computers. But also I founded a hosting business for like this kind of like zero data app. But so for me as an app creator, like I can invest in creating personal apps because it's also good for the hosting business, kind of, right? But also we don't charge for this storage for normal end users yet. So, but yeah, software as a service, I would say it's definitely the opposite of the zero data. You basically sell access to the hosted data back to the user. Of course, you can invest in improving the UI for accessing the data, but what you're doing in the end is hosting the data and basically charging for access to the data. So you can add APIs, so other apps can also access the data. But in the end, you're the point where every integration has to connect to and get permission to connect to and so on. And you are kind of selling like access to user data.
Okay, so we want to flip that then.
I still disagree with this. So from the user point of view, like this is a very technical way of looking at it. The user likes using a thing. They like to access it everywhere. They may want other features like, can I use this offline? And they might think that they need a desktop app or a mobile app because that's what they associate with using something offline. But and I think that there's another question about subscription models that recur monthly, which I think in general what we're seeing is a certain level of subscription fatigue, right? So that's a thing that people are like, can't I just pay once? So there's a thing that's happening. But I think my personal view, and Rosano and I have gone a little bit back and forth, is I'm like, the technology only matters of how an app is delivered only matters as much as what that supports in terms of distribution, where the user can use it and install it, and possibly what features it enables or disables. So in a SaaS model, as the developer, you have a lot more tools to be able to restrict things, right? I think that's like totally, Rao, that's something you were saying, like, yes, that is a thing that you can do. From the perspective of the user, they can't code, so it's fully restricted when using a zero data app as well.
I have a comment to say about that. So I agree with you in the sense that what users care about is using apps, right? But something that users already experience, and I think it's also really frustrating, is when they are using an app and then the providers stop using the app. Or maybe they make an update that breaks their feature they like the most, Then up until that point, users don't see the difference. But once that happens, if they are using this kind of application, they will notice that they can use another application that theoretically works with the same data, right? Or maybe they can keep using the previous version of the app. So I think that that's important, but I agree that right now users are not seeing this happening. But I think that at some point, if this happens, users will see the difference.
And that's kind of a feature, which is what Boris was saying, that it's a new capability that wasn't necessarily possible before with traditional SaaS models.
Can I also jump in if it is possible?
Please, yes.
Okay, I think that you're describing something which is very relevant, which is the idea of how do you kind of educate people into seeing an added value in this type of zero data business model. One of the things in my limited experience, I mean, I'm a PhD student. I'm teaching students. I work in education, so it's not. I'm not coming from a business perspective. I'm more coming from an academic perspective. But one of the things that I see, especially when I speak to non-computer scientists about open source applications, let's say apps or in general software that respects your values, is that you see that this software is built on a different paradigm. It's built on different sets of values, and these are things that people are looking for. They don't know where they are, and there is a high access barrier to these things. But what I really appreciated, and what got me here, I guess, in some sense, also in the work that Rosano is doing, is to lower this kind of access barrier. So in some sense, I understand that you are part of a consulting firm. And correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but my understanding is that from a point of view of the client and of the user, this educational value of understanding what your computer and what your software can do that you didn't think it was possible is also a very valuable tool, and something that as a professional you are giving to them.
I think that was definitely one of our premises, is that there's a certain amount of movement building. Just like in the past, there was movement building around open source. Many of the open source apps were the first hosted apps. I'm trying to avoid saying SaaS because Rosano can make a subscription to his Zero Data app, and it's software as a service.
Yeah, as you say, it's a delivery mechanism, not necessarily.
It's a business model. Yeah, and we conflate the two right now, right? So that is definitely one of the things that we put on the list of saying, what open source license should I pick? And open source means a couple of different things. I always think of it as meaning three things. I think it's useful to reiterate. One, open source licenses are a legal innovation. Before there wasn't a way to use the tool of copyright to actually lock software open in a really interesting and novel way 30-ish years ago, sort of thing, right? Like, two, open source is a label of how people collaborate on software together, right? We don't often see it like that, but that's something else that was pioneered, right? And three, it's a movement, a leaning, an ideology that people have some beliefs around. I think some of those things are changing, but it's definitely something that we don't want to. It's one of the things that I asked Rosano. I'm like, hey, is your stuff open source? So maybe a question, Rosano, do you think that the choice of open source license or being open source or not changes either users or other developers that you interact with, and why or why not you might open source your Zero Data apps?
I don't know if I noticed a huge difference for me from when it was private and when it was public, but I think I just feel better about it being open source. I feel like part of the ethos of what I'm trying to construct with my set of apps is this idea of the apps as like a public space, like a park. You just show up and you can use it. There's no doors, there's no walls. Like everything is out in the open. In the same way that we deal with articles and videos and links, we just share them around and people go there and they can just get into it. They don't have to do something. So I think when the code is open, it facilitates that kind of thing for the code, for the programmers there, but also just in people being able to answer their own questions. Again, I haven't observed people kind of going there. I haven't received a lot of questions about my code specifically, but I think I just feel better that it's like that. And yeah, I mean, if I get hit by a bus, somebody can recompile my app and it still works, so to speak. So yeah, and then there's also what are you selling? I'm selling something that is transparent, so you know what you're using. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at the code yourself. So I think that's something, to some people, that's going to be worth. It's going to be worth something. But it's very new to me, to be honest. I'm sort of still entering the open source world. I have a license for my thing, but I'm not super I feel like I have a sort of. There's I'm confused, to be honest. There's so much stuff going on. There's subscriptions, there's donations, there's Patreon, there's YouTuber. I'm trying to connect with all of this stuff, these patterns that I'm seeing in so many different places, and I feel like I don't have a cohesive way of thinking about what I'm doing exactly. But I'm trying to clarify that. But so whether something's open source or not, I think there's something good there, but I don't know how to articulate why it's good yet.
What do you want from your users, Rosano?
I would like them to have the same experience that I have, which is I feel like I can do more. I feel like I can increase the bandwidth of my own thinking, of my own perception, by just being able to use software in a good sort of helpful way, as opposed to in a harmful way, in a way that doesn't rob me of my attention, but in a way that feeds into me all the time. This experience that I have, I feel like I'm living 20 years in the future. Because I can do so many things, and I feel very organized, and there's like a place for everything, and it feels good. It feels kind of relaxing and comforting, and I feel productive, and I feel like I have a lot of potential as a human being, and like it's very like activating, you know. So
so this is amazing. Like basically, I'm like, Rosano, if I didn't even notice that you mentioned software in there. If that's what you're selling me, if you're selling me the best version of myself, why the fuck am I only paying you $5 a month?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of bicycle for the mind is not about the bicycle, right? It's actually about the mindset. It's about what you're able to do. So, we talk about the bicycle because I guess that's what we can see. And but also maybe in my perspective, like, okay, that's my story. I don't know that other people are feeling that same way, but maybe they are. I need to talk to my users more, right? So I need to understand, like,
snaps. That's always what we have to do infinitely more of, right?
Yeah.
I want to actually ask. So David, you've recently gone sort of full time into your open source endeavors, haven't you? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, part of it now is like getting it started through some consulting, but yeah, part of the idea is to go to the point where you have a revenue stream that's not just donations, because I think for me, I've kind of hit, or I feel like I've almost hit without like a significant effort that is almost the same as starting a SaaS business, to get more supporters, like hit like that peak, which, you know, is not insignificant, but it also definitely far from enough to support like even one person.
I'm going to ask you actually to step back a second, because I obviously know you, but if you can tell us what you're working on.
Good point. I'm going to turn my video on too. So I've been like since 2010 working on a open source project that was mainly targeted towards creating web APIs, but that now is like also taking a direction in more user-owned data, because I find that super interesting, and a lot of the experience and like patterns that are used in that project, I think can apply very, very well there as well. And yeah, it's gotten to the point where the project was either like too, it's called Tethers. Did I mention that? Yeah, it works with JavaScript, and it gotten to the point where it was too big to like do it on the side, but it's not quite there yet to support myself fully without any additional revenue streams. So one of the goals is to, it's like the in-between step. So right when we're talking about zero data apps, to me, I think where the revenue there is connecting it to other things, or to the old world, so to speak. So I almost, like one of the last time here, right, I did a demo on how to deploy to a server using IPFS, but people still have to run the servers. So that is one way of doing that. And I've been seeing a lot of other things for like zero data apps, like receiving emails, sending text messages. Those are all like valid revenue streams that, especially as developer tools, and the low level tooling, I think that we'll kind of need for this kind of stuff. But yeah, so coming back to what you asked about, like the funding, people always looked at, like, because I do it through GitHub sponsors. I used to do Open Collective, but the problem was, like, if only one person is doing 90% of the work, it's not really a collective, and you don't really know how to distribute the money very well. So GitHub sponsors was a better way for that, but you still always hit a peak. So most projects either have the problem of not having enough sponsor revenue or not knowing what to do with it. And the money just sits in Open Collective and collects. So I think having real utility that people are willing to pay for is probably the ultimate goal for some of these things, at least to me. Did I answer your question?
Good texture. I mean, I think that's a really interesting statement. Rao, go ahead.
So we're talking about software very generally, but if we're talking about zero data software, I mean, like when so when the app doesn't want your data or store the data on its servers, usually the way it works, obviously, is that like if you want to sync that data, you use some kind of data storage like thing, which is like different from the app, right? So which both means that if you don't run your own storage pod, you'll have to pay, like that has to be sustainable for someone to run it. And then it creates the problem for the app developers. Then the user has to pay or like make it sustainable for both the app developer and the storage service to exist if they don't want to host any of it themselves. So obviously open source helps in this way that the users can host everything themselves if they want to, but they can also choose to, for example, only host one of the two themselves. Like you can mix and match. You can like host the app, but not host the storage, or the other way around. Generally, the storage will be more useful to host for you because the app is like, it's just a thing that you have on your device somewhere. So that's also probably where most of the money usually goes. So most like app developers probably make less money than Google for Google Drive or Dropbox for providing Dropbox access to people, right? So I think there's both a UX and like the issue with like the user knowing that there's these two things and being able to sign up for these two things, or like somehow get like to a point where they can support the two things. And then, yeah, also like there's a lock-in issue, and like it doesn't really, for example, if you have an open protocol, like the one that Rosano's using that I'm working on as well, it doesn't matter that much if the client app is, for example, open source. Like any proprietary app can add, data sync, and for the user, if they don't want to change the app or self-host the app, for them it's open access to, as long as they can, add their own storage pod as a config. So I'm starting to ramble, but I just.
No. And I think this is an emerging thing. So we're part of a group at the Decentralized Identity Foundation that is working on distributed data storage as a standard. You work on remote storage, which is a spec, and Fission has its own solution of this, but we're talking to different people about standardizing it. There's Solid Protocol. That's roughly the three that are out there right now. Our hypothesis at Fission is that this actually looks a little bit like, just to very respond to what you were saying, I totally agree. I see it the other way around, where we can have paid user accounts at Fission, where users pay for storage, among other things, for the convenience of us keeping stuff online. They can do it themselves. They can, it's an open protocol of IPFS, so that, and we're actually going to make some tools so that people can run nodes themselves. But many more people, if we're successful, we think will want the convenience of having someone who's taking care of stuff for them, having a commercial relationship with someone. And what I want to see is if through an app that someone uses of Rosano's, I'd like to do a revenue share. If a user upgrades to a paid account, it is because of the apps that they are using in aggregate, right? Apple doesn't currently share revenue if someone upgrades their iCloud storage account, but I think that they should. And so that's one of the things that I'm thinking about. You're totally right, is that there's this conflation again of hosting, data storage, and apps. And there's this weird thing where the app isn't worth $0. If anything, the data should be worth $0.
The problem is the marginal value of software is exactly $0 because it doesn't cost anything to copy and install it. So basically downloads are for free for this amount of data. So the marginal value is actually zero. That's the problem with selling software again.
Jury?
Well, it's never zero because any software, especially web software, rots in months. So if there is nobody to upgrade it, update the libraries, whatever, if there is no maintainer, it's just not working within a very short time.
I think this is a really, really interesting point. And again, this is kind of what I was trying to get at with what do you want from your users, right? If a user likes an app, open source or not, and wants it to survive, or wants new features or wants specific things, what is our ask of users, right? I think that where David ended a little bit in what he was saying about having real utility that people want to pay for. So like, yes, but that's also, and for dev tools, that makes total sense. For end user facing tools, I would ask the question, right, if you care to have this exist, shouldn't you pay to make sure that it sticks around? Which is a different relationship that we're used to. It's a less commercial relationship.
Less transactional, say, also.
Yes, yes. And this is, I think, the complicated thing about donations and what we think about some of that.
I agree with this idea, but I see a problem in practice, and it's related with the tragedy of the commons. Because if we do this kind of thing, in the end, if it's in the hands of the user, if they pay or not, some users will pay because they want the application to keep running, but most users won't. And
so unfortunately, tragedy of the commons and that phrase means the exact opposite. And unless you do the original reading, you won't find this out. So what the tragedy of the commons actually says is, if you don't put fences around the commons and form people into a collective, then the tragedy will occur. So the tragedy of the commons lesson actually is the people who contribute should have specialized status. That is the message of the tragedy of the commons. Members versus non-members, roughly.
Well, I think I have read the original one, so share the link with me later on to see if I didn't read the proper one.
Eleanor Ostrom wrote about it, and then somebody wrote a critique of it, which literally flipped around, and unfortunately, it's turned into the lexicon, and it has meant to say that you will have lots of freeloaders. Correct. If you do not put barriers around things, you will have freeloaders, which is why you need barriers. And barriers don't need to be a bad thing. They can be a positive thing. So one of the movements that's coming up is a number of people, I'll actually share the link later, are talking about things like, if you're not a GitHub sponsor, any issue you file gets auto-closed.
Oh.
Software is still open, still available, openly licensed, but if you file an issue and you're not a sponsor, cool. And a little message says, you're not a sponsor. If you would like this issue to be addressed, sponsor. Lorenzo, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to tell you, okay. Just this last thing that you told, that you said, is not like fully. It's not something that I think I would be looking forward to. But it's okay. It's I think that the spirit is also to share. I want to share a bit of research that has been going on recently. This is a group of academics, so it might be a bit more on the academic side. I think I understand you're more developers, but this is still like quite relevant research. What they're working on is that this is a group of people that are working on rethinking what it means to have digital commons currently, and they are working on this idea of peer production. And by the way, this is the sorry, I sent it just to Boris. Yeah, here it is.
I posted it to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I know Kobley, which is here, is also working on peer-to-peer technology. So it's a good coincidence. But it's interesting if you dig through that. This book that they have written is scattered around the web, but it's freely available. They have an interesting tidbit where they explain the difficulties of sharing something. Of publishing something in the academic way, even though they meant it to be public. But it's interesting. If you read through there, I think you find some good perspectives of why this relationship doesn't need to be necessarily transactional from a money exchanging perspective. So I think it gives some good insights in that direction.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. And Noel, very briefly, this is what happens when we take entire papers and we use them as a phrase, tragedy of the commons, right? Like, my point was basically that it's been used as a catchphrase by a lot of people, and we haven't actually gone back to examine it and think about how things have changed, right? Like, I think this is one of the challenges in moving back and forth in lens, or even what you say is this back and forth between exploring in real world of attempting to build software, attempting to open source things, attempting to build a community, attempting to form users, and actual primary academic and user research and other things like that, which is this long tail that often itself is actually disconnected from what are the patterns that emerge from GitHub as the primary social and code repository in the world, right? Like in fact, a lot of these activities are because of certain actions or interface elements that literally github.com decides to make. If they add a feature that integrates issue access with GitHub sponsors, what will happen? Which is itself a problem that we're coalescing around a commercial entity owned by Microsoft. It's a problem. I'm not like, I'm not even gonna go into deeper of why that might be a problem, but I think it's, it is connected for sure.
I had a question for David. If you wouldn't mind saying, what exactly was the difficulty in sharing the funds? Like, what was the challenge in trying to figure out who gets what from your open collective?
There are a couple of different ones. One was that people just didn't care, or like they didn't want money for it. Very often that was Europeans in very bureaucratic countries where getting money sent from a US non-profit entity is it's much more pain than it's worth in tax implications. And the other problem was that it's really difficult to put a value on things if the funds are like, even if I would just pay myself a third of what my normal rate is, it would probably not be, the funds wouldn't cover it. So it was really difficult to put a number on it, especially if it's worldwide, to say like, okay, like, me as like a consultant, like I know my rate, but if it's just somebody who just started and made a contribution, what is that value? And then it's also like figuring out what are valuable contributions. Should I pay people for fixing a typo? I think it's great that people fix typos, but that's not the value for me as a maintainer. The value is when people make contributions that take work off my plate, and that has not happened very often, unfortunately, even less so. And I think this is an interesting thing we've been like talking about here, is that the transactional value, I found that open source in general has become much more transactional ever since the massive adoption of like Microsoft and Facebook and Google, basically having a monopoly now on the big projects that everybody's talking about, at least in the web space. And that created this kind of like really not communal attitude, really. Like when we had added TypeScript to the repository, it was one of the worst experiences I've had in 15 years of doing open source, with the people that were coming from that kind of an environment that Microsoft created. And they didn't like it I don't think that it was a bad intention, that they created a well-maintained product that works well and, where people get their questions answered. But it's definitely not the attitude that you would need for an open source project that is more communal.
Bastja, I see your question, but I wanted to also ask Alexander Copley if he's there to maybe talk about his experience with splitting the funds, because he had a recent, I would call it a success with being funded, and I think they just shared it evenly. So if you feel like talking about it, maybe just describe the thought process and how you all came to that decision and what it was like, and how it might have related to some of the issues that David brought up about like, what are we paying each other for? And, or if you're not, then maybe just say no, and then I'll ask Bastja to. Actually, your audio is not connected, and I don't know if your video is connected, so maybe maybe let's just let Bastja continue.
If there's a link afterwards, that would be awesome as well, because I think examples are always helpful.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I guess this is the perfect moment for me to talk about what I've been doing for the last year or two. Actually, we've been so on the side while I was still working on the business. We kind of started like an open source project, and we didn't know if we wanted to found a company for that, or like how this would be sustainable. And we did not want to found a company because eventually all open source businesses go enterprise, basically. And we wanted, so we've actually been working on exactly this problem, like how do you value contributions and how can you pay every contributor? And we actually do pay people for fixing typos.
You're talking about Cosmos, right? Cosmos.
So you can find this on cosmos.org. There's a link to a wiki. So this part of the project is called Credits. So it's kind of like an open collective for a decentralized cooperative, and only using. It's in like pre-production. We still use a testnet with Ethereum, but we're going to deploy to RSK. But basically, we're only paying out in Bitcoin, which enables us to forego all that bureaucracy and send money around the world, like in tiny amounts and in a batch transaction to everyone who contributed. So we've been working on this for like quite a while, and the only problem that we've we're experimenting still, and the first thing we had to do was only this problem. There's no other problem, and it's a social problem much more than a tech problem. To like, how do I value a contribution? And then you collect that over time into a reputation. And also for us, we also want to reward long-term contributions, like regular contributions. So you also get a dividend basically on your reputation or your shares. So like the majority of the money is paid out for what happened last month, but then a small amount of the budget is actually paid out to everyone who contributed like in the past. So yeah, and most of that was not a technology issue, although obviously those are like all like, especially if you don't want to, like, it's basically impossible to do it in the traditional system, because as you say, like there's no way you can actually send bank transfers or like around the world to like every contributor. The world doesn't work. Like it works for you maybe in the US or in like some Western countries, but most of the world you cannot just send $5 around the world. So this is like it is a tech issue, of course, but yeah, I think it's mostly also like a social issue.
How long have you been doing that with the group?
Pardon?
How long has this model been working?
So that's what I wanted to get to is, so we've done this, we've basically done the tracking and everything, and without paying out any money, because we didn't have any, or they didn't put any money on it, for like a couple of years. And since 2019, I think, we started the actual tracking. And then last year in November, I think we started a 6 months. So we got a very generous donation from someone, and I also donated from my own funds on top to just support the project. And so we did a 6 months trial to see, because there's also no way you can actually plan this ahead of, like, before you do it, and then everything's like in place and everything's perfect and you know everything. So we've done a first trial which ran for 6 months, which we still haven't done the retrospective of, but basically have to do it like within the next couple of weeks. And so over those 6 months, we tried, like, does this feel right? Like, is it fair? Like, does everyone feel like treated fairly? Like, how did the amounts compare? And we actually changed stuff, like right in the middle of the trial already. We had to change like the distribution of how the money is paid out. And also we found problems that in hindsight is like completely obvious that we should have thought about this, but but we didn't. So basically we're experimenting with that. And if you're interested, you can also follow us on like the Fediverse or something, or you can join our XMP if you want. So
yeah, I've been doing open source for a very long time, and I think exactly this. When I started, a lot of the non-Western world wasn't really online yet. And what is amazing today is that we can say that there is quite good access globally of both users and developers, right? An inexpensive Raspberry Pi gets you pretty far in a lot of areas of the world. lots of these things. I'm glad that we ended up in talking a little bit about cryptocurrency and so on, because I think that there's interesting new tools. But in fact, while a lot of people work on the tech stack, a lot of the social things are way harder, right? I mean, David, when you said that, oh, it was tough to decide how to split, I'm like, okay, so what you're saying is you've underinvested in governance and community building, which is a classic phrase. I mean, there's the sort of benevolent dictator for life open source approach. I think I really like Open Collective because it's open source. I can run my own version. And that you use it in part because of the transparency. It doesn't solve the problem of who gets the money at all. Like, you have the same problem with GitHub sponsors. It just might be that you literally have it go to a single individual and then you no longer have the problem. And I think this concept of how do we compensate people globally is a really, really interesting one that's going to come to the fore in the commercial world because of all of the pandemic, work from home, remote work kind of thing as well. I've been thinking about that as well. And I think the other challenge that we have, two things. One, we're mostly very engineering focused here. Should I pay for a typo? Fuck yes. Ideally, that person starts fixing typos, and at some point they start writing release notes or blog posts or actually doing marketing, God forbid, for you.
I actually had this scheme I thought of for exploring my forum. It was like, I'll give you a badge if you add your name to this GitHub repository.
Yes.
Just
I think those sorts of a friend of mine that I've been going for coffee with, and we've been calling it entrainment. How do we actually create new paths? And again, what we haven't been talking about a lot of this is the responsibility of the user. I'm very interested in that half as well as the engineering side, because without the user half, the engineering side doesn't matter at all. And so how do we fold people into that? And possibly how do you move an app user into feeling more empowered to take ownership of the software with you as developer, rather than having this two solitudes kind of thing, right? I pay you $5, therefore you provide me something, right? And now I'm getting all the way into, like, Boris, that sounds awfully like that you're trying to like totally change how things work. Like, maybe.
that's what we want, isn't
So,
it?
I take your point on, like, making sure that you invest in governance, which is probably also a true criticism there. But I've been through projects that have spent all their time on that and had great patterns on how to create social credit and how money is potentially distributed, but nobody actually using it and or doing that. So I know a lot of those approaches are always well-intentioned, but the problem is, like, as well thought out as many of them were, you never had that critical mass to turn it into something viable either. So I've kind of seen both sides, and I still find it like almost so difficult that it's like I'm having a hard time trying like new things, because I'm like, well, eventually people, and that's the other problem, like a long-term plan, because people always like leave the project like all the time. Like how do you like get people involved in the long term? And I think the more noise, like I'm in the web space, it might be different, because the more noise there is and the more like big tech companies are creating projects or VC funded projects, the harder it is for like community organized projects to actually continue. And like all the big web project examples are either run by like a big tech company or by one or two people that somehow managed to make money off of it.
And I think in your context, who is the user is a really interesting one, right? Providing a development framework. The user is other developers who could easily switch hats and become a contributor, but some of them, especially agencies and others, might very well want to have a very commercial relationship, right? Which is a very different case than I'm making an app, right?
I think that's important to say here. There's the thing that I realized is that there is different like each project is different in like very specific ways, and you have to figure out what that means for revenue, I guess.
I wanted to share an example of something like, basically, I think that there are changes happening. There's a desire for more people and an education that Lorenzo mentioned as well of people who want to align their values, and that is something that we can do together. That's why I was so happy that Rosano kind of put zero data apps to try and put a bigger umbrella that many people could participate under. And I think, there's lots of people are willing to experiment in Web3, in peer-to-peer, in cryptocurrencies, which is good. That lets us learn by doing stuff. One of the projects, some of the people who work on it are here in Vancouver, that I know of, is called Pool Together. Essentially it is a category of no loss lottery. So people pool funds, then those funds are essentially sort of group invested, and those funds in aggregate make a technically daily return. And then that's put into a pool, and every few weeks, one person who is participating in the pool gets all of the interest or the yield. This actually comes from something that is growing financial systems, specifically in Africa, where this is used as a way to pool funds, where people get a year of savings, basically once per month, rather than everyone having to wait the entire year. There are some examples in the US and the UK of essentially savings accounts where this happens as well. So an idea that I had that might be user-centric is, could we get users of apps to lock in their savings and say, I would like 10% of the return to go to Rosano. So this is a really, really interesting model, because it's, one, recurring funds over time. Two, the user is not actually paying anything. They never lose their principal, right? So instead of asking them for $5 a month, you ask them to lock up $60 every year or something like that. Like, again, I haven't worked the numbers of where you would need to get to make this happen, but I think it's a really interesting new tool to experiment with.
One problem I see with that is that it's not really possible to lock in funds, because wherever you invest, there is always a risk. So there is always the possibility that this money goes down instead of going up, right?
So yes, a tool in the toolkit, right? So this is being used in the US with US dollars, which compared to other areas of the world and Forex goes up or down, right? But I think for me, the very concept of my savings being put to good work, I find amazing, one. Because technically, if you put your money in the bank, the value is only going down because inflation, right? And this is exactly where we go on a rant about how new forms of currency might be important too, right? Rosano, users, contributors, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking about community. I think for me, the most important next step for me is just to create a community around what I'm doing, around the people that are using the apps. There's also something about me needing to put myself out there a bit more, maybe demystifying code or doing like live streaming or ways to sort of bring people into code. So I'm thinking about like a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with programming, and it kind of alarms me because it's so involving, and I feel like I'm already kind of stretched too thin. But I'm sort of in two minds about it. I mean, there's all of that, and then on the other hand, like, okay, well, if I just focus on the app and just keep making it better, maybe it'll work itself out. And I don't know. So, but I'm more leaning towards this idea of like constructing a community. Like I like your idea about building software together. Like how can we get more people involved, more kinds of people involved? How can we get like normal people to figure out how Git works and maybe fix typos or write translations or release notes, as you were saying. So there's just so much, and I feel kind of overwhelmed. This is what I mean when I say I'm confused, because it's just like I have no map for any of this. So there's just so much stuff, and it's all just there on the table, and I'm trying to like figure out every day like what I'm supposed to do next. Yeah,
So
I'm feeling good.
Can you maybe talk about what it means to be, and I think maybe this is also what I was using the word independent to mean. Do you want to have more collaborators? Do you want to just work on this by yourself? What are your thoughts on that?
I want to have more collaborators. Yeah, I'm specifically tired of just working on my own on the code. Like, I do enjoy it, but like, it's just the scale of it. Like, I think I have 5 web apps now, and I aspire to like redo all of my iPhone apps on the web. And then I have like 5 other app ideas. Like, by the time I have like 10 or 20 apps or whatever, like it's not going to work as one person. So, yeah, so I need other people to work with me on this. And I also would like it. I would like the social experience of just collaborating with people. Don't have a lot of experience with that, but it's something that I think is going to be more important for me as time goes on. So being independent means like being able to work with other people. Yeah, I was going to say something about funding. Maybe like I have a. Yeah, actually, no, I don't have a clear thought about that. I'm going to wait. But
Yuri, go ahead.
Community is the more thing.
Yeah, just briefly, I think there is one thing in this whole zero data app, or what Fission is doing and others doing, in that the user control data or first. This is what we had with Poly the other day, that their innovation is to say, well, okay, let's have your personal online data yourself, and the algorithms come to you. The same here, that this whole zero data idea is, and what you did with Fission, Rosano, is that by design, by construction, every app in this ecosystem can be made interoperable with any others. So there are no barriers between apps. And that's what we really should leverage. And it would even actually bring the community together, because just to work out with you, Rosanna, how you're going to integrate my thing with your thing, which I started doing, that creates community. And this is where we should focus. And I think this is where Fission can really have this idea of I don't know whether you like this idea or not, but I really believe in the winner pays all. That's what because all this activity, all this, even the failures, those who don't, because there is the nature of the network effect that the best one will come up. But as you see in what we see in it with all this current craze of note taking and network thinking, there's just so much cross-pollination. Okay. Just by being there is important. So I know that's my pitch. Over.
If one aspires to make movements, it is incredibly hard to do as a single individual or a single organization. So we have to find some cross-cutting things that we can get behind. And see what we can do that have different approaches, but have some common themes that we can get behind, right? I mean, I think talking about it's really hard to send $5 to anyone on earth. Absolutely, it absolutely is. At the same time, I'm really excited by Open Collective. It's tied into TransferWise and PayPal, which does not cover the entire world, but covers a lot today, right? So that this is a toolkit, right? Tool in the toolkit. That's it. What works and doesn't work there versus what works elsewhere is really interesting. And then, yeah, I mean, I think it's getting people to care about these things. Like, where is the zero data app enthusiast community hanging out? I will say that I think that there's probably more to be done in the Fediverse around that. it's a little awkward because it's like, oh yeah, someone's running my server for me that I'm not paying for. There are examples of people, collectively funding servers. That's how I sort of re-entered and run my account on something called social co-op. So this aspect again of community and collectives comes up, and then possibly smaller communities, but that are more intense, is where the interesting experiments can happen. Yes, true.
Yeah, just one more thing. That's another thing. This is where it is really challenging. What you see is that there are. I'm following closely 6 or 7 decentralized ecosystems. Somebody within those, I certainly would like to say, bring together OBDB and Fission and possibly Holo and Airwave. We really should start the ecosystem to start a buzz about make them interoperable in some sense, because that's where real communities could actually. My main problem is I don't know what would OBDB, what would Fission, what Holo would say to that. So I'm just asking you.
I think that's really interesting. So there's Cosmos, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like source cred. Like ultimately, people are going to form together and try different things, right? How many different to-do apps are there? How many different note-taking apps are there? Oh God, blog engines, etc.
Sorry, the key is that, and all these has to be interoperable. That's the key.
I understand. So even that I've found a difficult discussion. So we're involved at some high-level standards bodies, the Decentralized Identity Foundation. Mainly, it's taking a lot of our time that ultimately doesn't go into doing other things. And I think that's the real challenge there at the end of the day. The story of standards and interoperability is that there has to be utility there in multiple directions, and someone has to have the time to do that working together. So like I'm not trying to skirt the question. It's literally like, okay, what is the driver that works on interoperability? Platform theory tells us that usually people in lead positions, or people who think that they're lead in positions, will in fact not work on interoperability. And so then we have to actually frame it in things, right? I really like that ActivityPub is something that people can build different services around, Mastodon and PixelFed and Pleroma and other things like that. And even with zero data apps, there's this interesting thing of doing different front ends or graphical front ends that are separate from protocols. That's super fascinating. Matrix is the other protocol. So I'd say ActivityPub and Matrix are 2 specs or standards that are widely interoperable and that lead to interesting directions. Lorenzo.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up Matrix actually, but you were mentioning it. I was just about to go into this. I think that if you look into that space, it's, to me, one of the most interesting things is that you see a lot of very, or at least to my knowledge, unique business models. For example, and especially with kind of recruiting inside companies, open source developers, people that normally are high contributors into open source parts of the ecosystem. So there is the case of this company that's called Beeper. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. And that's very interesting, right? Because basically they internalized one of the lead contributors in the Matrix open source world, and they're making, and they're selling this as a service, but at the same time they're contributing to the open source ecosystem, which kind of creates that platform effect, right? What are your thoughts into this?
I think unfortunately this just goes right back to what David was saying. So it's Eric Magowski, who's originally founder of Pebble. He's Canadian, and I know him. He's been involved with Y Combinator, and Beeper is his new company, which is like, hey, what if we had a single app instead of having to log into 83 different chat apps? Very interesting. I have signed up and I'm on the wait list. I paid to be on the wait list. They've chosen an open protocol at the core of their solution. How do I put this? They are socializing the costs of maintaining a secure, open, distributed protocol and privatizing the products by pulling together investment that will have much, much more polish than anything else in the Matrix ecosystem. So by internalizing a contributor, I would say that the tragedy of the commons applies. They have open access to the entire protocol, and they only have to pay one salary. That's it,
Can
please.
I jump in about Matrix? So I think it's actually a good example for what I was referring to as all open source companies eventually do enterprise business. So I think Matrix, almost all of the money that is flowing in the Matrix ecosystem is going to one single VC funded company, which employs most of the core developers. And then there's a lot of open source apps that actually, other client developers that don't ever get any money from anyone for writing like a Matrix client for Linux, for example, or for like various other things. There's only a single working server implementation that is actually full featured. So compared to something like XMPP, Matrix is completely centralized and the same enterprise thing. It's like they get money from governments and large corporations for servicing them. It's nice that it's all open source because we can all learn from what they're doing, and we can use the technology also. Like, it obviously has the potential to like be sustainable for more than just that one company, but in my opinion, it's very much captured by one company that actually does enterprise and government business. Yeah.
So there's a lot of nuance here. When I say Matrix, I mean Matrix, the spec and the open protocol. It is like literally the spec that happens to have some implementations. Element, the company, is the primary corporation that does a lot of the Matrix contribution and has the major clients and other things like that. XMPP was in a similar spot when it was started and when it was originally called Jabber. It has now, in part because it's fallen out of favor, been in a much more distributed way. James and I were involved, and I was actually a board member of Jabber at one point. At the very least, I would like us to have openly documented specs and protocols like HTTP. I consider Matrix in that category.
Yeah. So what I was, So I think we can all agree on that, and like basically especially if we want the app developers, users, and providers to all work together in a nice, friendly, open source world, and in a win-win-win situation. Basically, the protocol is the thing in the middle that it's how we communicate, right? And how we can do things together is having a protocol that we can all rely on. Someone still has to write the protocol, and the protocol can also be influenced. So in the now that we're in a zero data call, I don't know how closely people are following Solid, but Solid basically almost died just now because the company that had all of the funding and had Tim Berners-Lee working for them basically overruled almost all of the open source contributors from the outside. And there's both the company capture and the academic capture of the spec. So now we have a 300-page spec which nobody can implement because everyone wanted their features in. And there's a company that exploits everything, puts whatever they want on the domains, takes GitHub repos offline, and so on. So there's definitely a real danger to having one company be very powerful in an ecosystem.
No, please.
Yeah, so I am part of the Solid community, and I do Solid apps, and I don't know what you're talking about. So maybe you can give more details, because I think I don't work at Inraft, which is the company of Tim Berners-Lee, and I haven't felt any of this as a member of the Solid community, right? So maybe you can give more details on that.
I mean, I'm not going to wash your dirty laundry in public right now, but you should know what I'm talking about. This is all firsthand from people within the company, also people who have quit the company, open source contributors who were part of the open source community from day one. I mean, you should know what I'm talking about. It's a bit like, come on.
I think in general, so this is always the challenge, right? Of like I said before, with open source, benevolent dictator for life. In some ways, it's simple if there's an open source project that Rosano is in charge of, and he just gets to pick. Once we start scaling it, governance and community become an issue. I'm sure at Cosmos you have issues, so that the whole we pay every spelling mistake. Technically in these sorts of distributed systems, if people are not aware, there's this concept of Sybil resistance. If you can just spam GitHub identities, and you get paid for every spelling mistake, that it can be an attack on the system if you care about guarding against those sorts of things, right? Standards bodies at the IETF or W3C. I'll use those two as just sort of examples of ones that have been around for a very long time. The reality is anyone can participate, but really that means is more likely you're paid by some large company like IBM or Microsoft, where you have full pay to be able to just do standards work. As a small company, us participating in standards work means that we are at a disadvantage because, you know, someone who only does standards work isn't bringing software forward. So away from the specific example of solid protocol and what's going on there, you're right. Like that's an interesting follow-up and an offline comment. Like all communities will face this. Once there is seen to be value there, there will be bad actors who attempt to have more of the commons, right? And I think this is the thing that we keep coming back to, is how do you figure that out? I'll as in the follow-up notes, Dries Buytaert, who's the benevolent dictator for life of the Drupal project that I was involved with very early, wrote a really great post framing a bunch of these things, calling about open source makers versus takers, and he had some thoughts there on what that looks like, including really interesting things like how as an open source project gets more popular and you get more, for instance, questions, support requests, and other stuff like that, the code itself is a common good. It can be copied multiple times. But the number of contributors who have time to respond to support requests is, in fact, a constrained pool. And so that is something that can be depleted, and one has to look at, right? That has to come from somewhere. I want to do a time check. We're at about 20 after, about an hour and 20 minutes. This has been an amazing discussion that went all over the place. Rosano, is there other kind of final things that you want to cover or bring up or give people to think about?
I feel like I mentioned whatever I wanted to touch on. I was just kind of enjoying the discussion. So
I will ask you some things. What do you want from us? What do you want as a next step? Do you want people to check out Zero Data Apps? Do you want us to check out your source code? We'll do a follow-up in general, and I really want to make this a platform for you as well, as we do for other people who come on as presenters. So especially for this audience, I'd love for you to share your open source repos and some as well.
Yeah. When you say us, you're talking about the people in this chat?
And broadly on the internet, when we put it on the Fediverse and blog posts and so on.
Probably maybe the same thing I said last time, like try to use Zero Data Apps, try to help other people use Zero Data Apps, try to support people that are making Zero Data Apps. There's also this other thing that I published recently, Easy Indie App, like if you're able to do self-hosting, if you're able to help other people do self-hosting, I feel like that's another piece of all this, although I don't imagine most people will, when we talk about app users, I hope that they won't have to do self-hosting, but it is useful, in the things that it enables, especially when you can just have one-click access to so many kinds of services and stuff. So help empower people by using these technologies, because they are empowering. As I said before, I feel super empowered by this. I'm not making $300,000, but I feel super fucking empowered by doing what I'm doing. And I wish other people could feel the same way. So, and I think we're all capable of helping other people in our circles to get more into this, right? And that might mean just sharing the Zero Data App website, but it's probably more like, help them set up their pod, or help them understand, like help translate, in without jargon, like those kind of things, which I think we're all capable of, and we all have opportunities to do that stuff.
I think that's really interesting and a takeaway of sort of user onboarding as a takeaway. Please go ahead.
Just wanted to add that a great idea. Like I think the more people we get to self-host the data pod, like no matter what protocol it's running in any matrix, XMP, solid, whatever, like it would put them in a position. First of all, it's what we want from the protocol, right? That like you control your data, not someone else. So we as technical people would love that. But also it removes the friction of like between having to pay maybe like a provider and an app developer. So you can focus much more on like, I have all my data in this pod. Now, like, who do I get the apps from? And it's immediately obvious that that has to be sustainable. So I think that's a good idea if we all push for like more self-hosting and making it easier to do so.